Hi, this is Peter Teuscher. I'm here with my colleague Tobias Demker. Thanks for joining us for another episode of our podcast, where it's basically a conversation around all things personal development, leadership, organizational stuff, and a little philosophy. So how are you doing this morning, Toby?
Pretty good. I just took my daughters to school on skis today, actually. So we got a lot of snow here in Sweden. So yeah, it's pretty good.
That's great. That gives me this. That almost seems like a stereotypical Swedish thing that you would do, on the sled or on skis or something. That's funny.
It hardly ever happens anymore nowadays, but so when you get the chance, you really want to do it. Yeah, no, it's really nice. It brightens things up a lot when you have snow here, so it's nice.
Yeah, same. Actually, Hamburg has snow as well, which it hasn't had for a couple of years. So yeah, last year was a very warm winter, and we had one night of frost, and then the year before, I think there was one day where it snowed a little. We've had the whole weekend, and the new foster dog I have is loving it, and I am too. Actually, it brightens things up, so I'm feeling great.
Yeah.
Cool. So what are we going to talk about today?
Well,
other than the weather.
Yeah, well, we can always discuss the weather now, but we have, something that I think is really important, and I thought about it. It was interesting yesterday. I was I'm sending my kids all over the place, but I was driving my son and his friends to hockey practice, and I got stuck behind this car, and it was going really, really slow, and I felt like, I'm getting a little bit, anxious or a little bit frustrated. But then I started thinking about the topic for today, and I realized, okay, I should just calm down. You don't know what's happening here, so, just take it easy. And I just had the opportunity then to proactively practice my empathy, and, I just made it a lot better. So, that being the topic for today, it was interesting to see how it can just click in if you proactively think about it. I need to put on a bit more of a empathetic approach to things, or empathetic perspective, and it allows me to calm down a little bit. It allows me to be more understandable and more forgiving, and just easing things up. So that would be the introduction for the topic.
Yeah.
But empathy is something that is kind of a value to me that I think is super, super important in very many different aspects of life. So let's have a conversation around that and see where it takes us.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. I think whether it's your personal life, whether it is your role as a leader of an organization, or just being able to interact well with people and communicate well with people, empathy is sort of at the core of that. I've done some. I did an online course on CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and there's an element. There's a portion in there where you talk about communication and communication skills, and there's the very self-centric kind of view where it's all about how am I feeling, how am I interpreting what's going on, and then sort of getting to that next stage where you can actually go put yourself in that other person's shoes and get a sense of, well, what are the words that they're saying, what is that do, what is that portraying in terms of what's going on within them. So just in everyday communication, it's important. Obviously we've talked about leadership as well. I think if you can't have empathy for what your team is going through, or what your customer is going through, or what a board member is going through, whatever level you're working at, I think it's really, if you don't have that level of awareness that allows you to feel empathy, it makes it difficult to be a good communicator and a good leader.
Yeah, and I think that perspective is really important as well. What you mentioned, like understanding what your leader is going through as well. We all like to bitch about our leaders, maybe, but they are in a pretty tough situation as well.
Yeah.
But maybe, because you mentioned your CBT course and maybe in coaching as well, how you work with empathy. So maybe a starting point would also be how to define empathy.
Mm-hmm.
So or maybe I'll just put that question to you first and see if we are aligned on our, our definition of empathy, actually.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people confuse empathy and sympathy, right? And so I always, as a coach, I really encourage people to themselves not getting into a victim role, but also not, encourage that in others. And I think the whole, oh, poor you, oh, you're really commiserating with someone, that falls into that sympathy category. But empathy is really about saying, wow, I can imagine that must be difficult for you. So it's trying to put yourself in the position of that other person, or being able to see through that other person's eyes, or walk a mile in their shoes, as it were, without taking on that emotion or trying to get into the same state as them. It's getting a sense where someone's coming from, without letting them bring you down to their level, sort of thing, in terms of their emotional state. That's roughly the way I would see it.
Yeah. Well, I think in that case we're probably really aligned, because I think it's super important to distinguish it from that feeling that, oh, I need to take on your emotions and feel the same way about it. It's one thing to be understandable and wanting. I think this is the key for me, to have the proactivity or the proactive approach, kind of to be willing to understand where you're coming from and your perspectives, without or taking on the emotions that this person might be having, right? Because that's more of a sympathy, oh, poor you, or whatever. Yeah. But I think that willingness to really have a proactive approach to understand what's happening in your situation without immersing yourself in it. I mean, kind of so understanding and being swept away for it. It's two different things. So I think it's really important to have that also holistic, or sort of helicopter view, to understand what's going on for the person, but also the greater context of things. So it's about, as you say, communication and asking a lot of questions, the active listening, of course, to really feel in without being pulled in that sense.
Yeah, and I think what's really important in empathy as well is that it is something that's authentic. And we had a previous conversation about this, and this whole thing about when you first see someone, how you doing today, and a lot of times it's just kind of this very automated response, and it's and even if someone is authentic about, actually I'm having a little trouble or whatever, and then the person who asked the question actually just moves right on to their topic of business or whatever, and they aren't actually interested in the question they've asked. So I think authenticity is a really important piece to empathy, because if you're just trying to play this role or give the impression that you're being empathetic, but really internally, people pick up on that. And I think if it lacks authenticity, it's just an exercise, and it doesn't really have an effect.
Yeah, I mean, taking the time to actually listen for the response. That's an important. I mean, as you say, I guess we all do ask that question. How are you doing today? And if you don't get the yes, everything, or what do you say? Like, I'm fine, thank you. How are you? If you don't get that response, then you just move along. Yeah. But yeah, there is a theory regarding empathetic leadership that I think describes quite well what you're talking about, the part of authenticity in it as well. Where, I mean, you have empathetic leadership when you, as I said before, that you have the willingness to understand and care for the other person. So there's a proactive willingness approach to understand, but also to support this person. And and you need that kind of authenticity in there. If you don't have the authenticity, so you're pretending that you're willing to understand, but you're not actually supporting this person, that comes off as a deceptive kind of leadership, and I guess that can go into destructive leadership. So you got empathetic leadership. I mean, authentic empathetic leadership, and then you have deceptive leadership, but then you also have callous leadership where you're just being a bit too harsh. So talking about empathy and empathetic leadership, it's really easy, but it really takes a lot, right? In being authentic and really wanting to care. And then if you get the response of, well, I'm having some troubles at home, are you then willing to take your time to support and walk the extra mile to support this person in a leadership position?
Yeah, I think there's a number of areas where it can be really difficult to, just because of our familiarity or our habitual way of being in certain roles in certain situations, where it becomes, especially where we're taking other people for granted. So in personal relationships where you've been, in a relationship with someone for a long time, whether it's family member or a spouse or, a life partner, you find a lot of people taking each other for granted and not really, perhaps not being as empathetic as they can be. And then for upper management, leadership roles, people are, they're measured on their results. In some companies, it gets really difficult because, I've worked in organizations where the only thing that mattered was the profit that I delivered, right? I was measured on no other KPIs. And you show me a CEO where the board is measuring him on, how much empathy he has for his, how well he, treats people, how happy they are in their workplace, and so on. Most people at high-level management are held accountable for the numbers, and certainly in some organizations, other things. But that seems to be the thing. And so when you've moved up the ranks in an organization, and the culture is to be somewhat ruthless or really just very bottom line oriented, then you probably haven't learned that skill, and so then it's you're worried about your hitting your numbers or hitting the quarter, or what are you going to tell the board, or what are you going to tell your line manager, and then you think about that person who's under all that pressure goes home to their partner, and they've had some kind of a drama with their relationship, and you're going, can't even relate to that because you're under so much pressure, and you're asking yourself, well, don't they know what I'm going through? And we make all these assumptions that people should just know what's happening inside us. And so, those are all areas where empathy is important. So whether it's, I know we're both big fans of Simon Sinek, and he really talks about that in terms of leadership. You have, let's say you have someone who's always been great at their job, and all of a sudden they start to perform poorly, right? You go in and you go, listen, you're just not cutting it. You better, shape up, or I've got to, make a tough decision, that kind of thing. Or you go, hey, what's going on? Here's what I'm seeing. What's happening? Is there something in your private life? Are you doing okay health-wise? And, those are ways as a leader that it's important. You can lose a lot of good people if you don't adopt a position of empathy when things get tough. And again, that's the difference between empathy and that sympathy. It's not like you're not trying to be their buddy, or you're not trying to commiserate. Yeah, things really suck here. No, you're trying to understand what state they're in, what kind of view of the world is, how they're approaching things, what their current challenges are, so that you can help them. Then you can take that supporting role as a line manager to try and get them through it. And the same goes in personal relationships. Just if you don't have some degree of empathy of what someone else is going through, they're probably not going to be motivated to have any kind of trying to understand what you're going through either.
Yeah. No, so what you're saying is that we can, by sort of exhibiting or showing more empathy, we're able to grow empathy into our relationships and with other people as well, right? And I guess you see that among, if you start with kids, you talked about adult development, and if you look at the egocentric self, of course there's not a lot of room for empathy there, but still you see a lot of children who are still stuck in a sort of egocentric stage, that they are able to show empathy at times, right? Maybe not all the time, but a lot. And you see a lot of care and empathy and a willingness to understand there in certain situations. So what I'm interested in is, I mean, if we take the philosophical approach, that I believe that all people are able to show empathy. I mean, are all people born good or not? I don't know, but but all people have the ability to show empathy and to be empathetic. However, there are always things that are coming in the way, right? I see myself as, a pretty empathetic person. I hope that my people, or people that are close around me, would describe me like that as well. But of course, I see myself many times not being empathetic as well. So it's interesting to be able to identify, what are the things that are coming away or obstructing empathy. And I mean, what you just mentioned, I think that was a really good example in the organizational department or in the organizational environment, that we have all these milestones and pressures and KPIs to hit. So pressure is on, right? And if I don't reach my KPI, do I have the luxury of showing empathy to you or to anybody else? It's not that easy, right? But that's why it's important to talk about it and raise some awareness about my empathy and how can I demonstrate empathy more in my relationships and in the workplace, and noticing that it's actually not that easy.
No, and a key component of that is learning to be self-reflective, right? So that's something that kids have to learn. That they talk about the different stages of development in children, and that first of all, being able to recognize themselves in a mirror and recognizing their identity, and then at some point being able to put themselves in it's that ability to think abstractly and then be able to put themselves in the shoes of another and that sort of thing. And so that's certainly something that we have to learn. And empathy is a skill that we can develop. But it takes a degree of self-reflection that not everybody has. But I agree with you, almost everybody has the ability to be empathetic, with the exception of, psychopaths, which are obviously a very small segment of the population. So generally speaking, most people that we would interact with have the capacity for empathy, absolutely. But they sometimes lack the other skills that help them to be empathetic. People are so stuck in their own thoughts and seeing the world through their own paradigm that they sometimes have difficulty. I mean, that's where you see so much of the polarization that we see in countries like the U.S., where we've seen all of the political divide, people not willing to see things. In fact, being condemned by their peer groups if they're willing to have some empathy for the other side. And that's a dangerous situation to get in. But in the more day-to-day, we are tribal in many ways, and so you have this allegiance to your group, your in-group, your tribe. But we've come as far as we have as a species from our ability to cooperate. That's why we're at the top of the food chain. If you want to be successful in any kind of role where you have to have good communication or any of your relationships, you need to develop that empathy. And that, I think, lack of empathy is a huge piece of why we see so much confrontation, so much dysfunction, so many people just not getting along. And in terms of the learning piece, I think another thing that's important to consider is that there's also communication styles, right? There's, we talked about learning. There's different ways that people learn. Kinesthetic. There are people who are more auditory or visual, and so on. And so I think when you recognize the way that people, it's that in coaching when you talk about building rapport, they talk about that in NLP as well, building rapport.
Yeah.
So you try to mirror someone to make them feel like you're on the same level as them. But really listening to what they're saying, it feels like this situation, or I really hear what you're saying there, or I can see what you mean. Obviously you can't visually see what someone means, but you're communicating, their style, their visual or auditory or kinesthetic and so on. So I think that's a really important thing. And we've done there's been a lot of work done, on the various personality tests, or like the DISC model from Marsden, where some people call it colors as a variant of it, where it helps people understand your communication style, your personality style, in order to improve, the way you communicate, or the approach you take to interacting with people. So those are tools we can use in order to help us be more empathetic in the workplace, just by understanding, the way I communicated this isn't a way that person's going to be able to receive it, or the way I handled that situation is going to cause confrontation with that other person. So
I think that's a good point. I mean, I have my issues with a lot of validity and reliability of these personality tests, but I think that's one of the benefits with it is creating an awareness about, how can I interact with other people in a more empathetic way, to put it proactively on myself. So what can I do to make things better in our relationship, or to be able to communicate better, and be curious about, what's going on. So I think that proactivity, to put it on myself. What can I do to support you, or what can I do to help our relationship? That I think that's super, super important. And the other thing that you talked about is really the environment that we're creating. We talk a lot about what kind of organizational culture we want to organize, but if you look at that macro level, as you're saying, with social media platforms that we are having today, we're kind of fed with the input that we are supporting. So our own egos, or our own ideas are being supported by more and more data of what we think is interesting, and that, I think, that can backfire. And I think we see that a lot. As you're saying, a lot of the confrontations that we're seeing today is because we can't see the other view. We physically don't have access to that data. So to be able to then proactively instead ask, what is making you think that way, or what's happening in your world to have that view, or whatever. And I think it's becoming more and more important for us to ask those kind of questions, and not having the approach of I'm right, you're wrong, but instead of that's interesting. I love that from one of my favorite books, actually, The Art of Possibility by Xanders. He always talks about that pause when something goes wrong, and instead of going into judgment, just thinking, that's interesting, that's interesting. and having the curiosity, what's going on here now? Why are we not agreeing? And that comes into to conflict management, to any kind of communication that you're having, to so many different aspects of not only organizational stuff that we are interested in, but just in relationships all over the place.
Yeah.
So proactive stance,
Yeah, Eckhart Tolle talks about that too. He maybe not that pause, but he talks about, is that so? It's about challenging your assumptions and your bias. And I think part of the problem with empathy, or being able to exhibit empathy, is people don't even have empathy with themselves. In terms of and that sounds like kind of a strange statement, but if you can be an observer of what you're going through, sometimes we have this really strong inner critic, and we're just condemning ourselves, and then we take a step back and realize, well, anybody in that situation would have a challenge. It's normal or whatever. So I think knowing yourself a little bit, and that's where I agree with you on the limits of the whether it's Myers-Briggs or Berkman or all the various different tests. They have their limits, and they don't tell you who you are. They're not. It's not a way of discovering your identity, right? So, but it does help you understand yourself and your needs in terms of what you need from other people. But then it also helps you gain insights into what other people's needs are. So I just wanted to go back to what we were saying before, just to clarify that. And then in terms of the sort of questioning the is that so, I think that's another really important piece to empathy, is recognizing, what your assumptions are, what your biases are, and just, making sure that you're not jumping to conclusions and judging people too harshly. And so there's a very specific bias that's referred to as representative heuristic, and it's this whole thing where if it seems like X, it is X. Like we to me it seems this way, so that's the way it must be, right? And when we're jumping to those kind of conclusions, that dissolves empathy, because we're no longer able then to see it from another angle that someone else may be seeing it as.
Yeah. Interesting. I mean, you made me think about this kind of self-empathy now, that, being a little bit more forgiving to yourself. And when we talked about the definitions of empathy, we didn't really go there. So I don't know how well it fits in, but the line of thought is a little bit that it's in our work, or in our road to self-understanding and the lack, or doing less sort of self-judgment. It's so important. And I learned, it was one of the first accreditations I took. It was about it's called the Leadership Circle. But we had this great teacher, and she just taught us to ask ourselves 5 times, if we're having a risk, and to challenge our self-assumptions. What's at risk if I do this? And then, okay, well, if that happens, what's at risk then? And then when you peel off all these layers, you realize that, well, there usually aren't that many risks, right? So we're putting all these self-assumptions on ourselves and not showing empathy to our true self, and that's kind of obstructing us to reach our objectives, or to reach our true authenticity, or whatever it might be. And I find myself doing that all the time, of course, as most human beings are. But creating that awareness about asking that question, so what's at risk here? What's at risk if I do this? And if you think deep enough about it, of course there could be things, but very often it's false assumptions. It's just, well, that person might think that I'm not cool enough, or whatever.
Yeah, we're all driven by fear to some degree, and I think when you recognize, in my own personal philosophy, I have this, and this may sound a little woo-woo or spiritual, but I find everything comes down to this dichotomy between love and fear, right? And so, however you define love, but as a positive kind of, I always say when people go, wow, that I love your cooking, I go, yeah, because I did it with a lot of love. That was the main ingredient,
Yeah.
And so you don't hear people talking about that in business much. So so maybe you can, the positive side of things and fear. But fear for me is that obstacle that we have to that we seek to overcome. It's that challenge, that resistance we feel, right? So so when you can start to recognize that, when someone's angry, or someone is, lacking the confidence to do something, or when they react in a way that's trying to undermine someone else, when you can recognize that that's a fear-based behavior, that is a fear-motivated behavior, then you can have a little bit more empathy, and you start to recognize, well, what's the fear behind it, and how can I help them overcome that? How can I soothe their fear, so to speak? That is an empathetic stance that you can take that will be far more productive than, well, what an idiot, totally lost his cool, instead going, I wonder what the fear was behind that action or those words that were said, and then start to get behind them, and that's what the empathetic process is all about, right?
Yeah, we actually had in a working group that I was working with, we had discussions around those fears in terms of the SCARF model. I think it was there's this Australian neurologist, I think David Rock, he came up with this model of how we all have fear of losing certain things, and it can be a status or certainty or there's autonomy, fairness, and something else. I forgot the whole model. But it was really interesting in this discussion to first of all think about, okay, so what's most important for me? What might I be afraid of losing, right? It's tapping into your values as well, like what you really value and what would you have a real fear of losing. But then also then comparing with others and having discussions about what about you? You know, what's most important to you, or what are you most fearful of losing? And that also was a really good platform to creating a little bit more empathy and understanding about, you know, what's important to you, what's going on for you. And I do believe that it was really helpful discussion for our team, actually.
That's interesting.
Just to create that kind of empathy. You know?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's interesting because you know you can relate that to on the personal side or the business side, right? And when you, especially, so if you're in a relationship or your friendships or whatever, or if you're leading a team, and to look at things in terms of, well, what does that person need right now? What and is there something about that need that I can give them, that I can provide, right? So when you approach things in a way that you want to enable the behavior that you're hoping to get out of that person, you do it with empathy, right? You do it by trying to get behind, you know, what's actually, you know, feeding into the dysfunction or whatever that's causing stress.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've been talking about kind of empathy within ourselves and empathy towards others, and I think we've identified a few things that we can do in terms of self-awareness and asking ourselves questions and looking at our own values and needs and fears to enable a bit more empathy towards ourselves. What I think would be really valuable as well is to talk about, you know, what can we do. And I mean this for my own development as well. What can I do to develop my empathy towards others, to be able to be a bit more consistent in that approach? Because as I said, I realize that I can show a lot of empathy a lot of the time, but I realize there are situations where I you know, it doesn't show up as naturally, if I put it that way. So, you know, what can we do to show, or what are some techniques maybe to practice our empathy towards others? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it all starts with a level of self-awareness, right? We talked about self-reflection, and so understanding what state you're in. So are you even in a state that you can be empathetic? Because if you're very emotional and that really tends to, you know, make us go within and you know, look at our own needs first when we're suffering to some degree. I mean, suffering, you know, in a very you know, we call, in the Buddhist sort of reference to it, where, you know, our thoughts cause our own suffering. But once we can sort of reflect and get a check on that, it's practicing things like trying to understand, being curious about the person you're interacting with, and you can ask yourself things like, you know, we talked about the various learning styles, but there's also in CBT, they talk about cognitive flexibility and being able to. So some people are very broad thinkers. They're the visionaries. They don't like to get into the details, and that infuriates those people who are very pragmatic and are asking, like, well, how do we get it done? Give me the specifics, right? So there's the people who are very theoretical and the people who are the real doers. And so when you can start to recognize, I think it's this. Once you recognize that, okay, I'm ready, I'm in a state where I can be empathetic, then the process is, okay, now I'm going to be curious about the person that I'm dealing with. So how might they be seeing things? And I think, I'm a big proponent of systems thinking and systemic principles, and that whole approach is, you zoom in to look at the details, you zoom out to see the bigger picture, and then you recognize the relationships between the different elements of a system, whether it's relationships or a process or whatever. And I think when you can take a systemic approach to it, you are, by the nature of systemic thinking, you're looking at it from different angles. And that's, for me, what empathy is all about: seeing it from different perspectives, trying to get a sense of what someone else is going through, or what a situation that we haven't experienced may be like, and so on. And so it's really approaching a lot of things with a sense of curiosity. What about you?
Yeah.
What do you?
That stance of proactive curiosity that we've been talking about, I think that's super, super important. To just practice that, asking questions, and when asking a question, allowing space for listening. That these are maybe just basic coaching skills, I guess. But for instance, I think I told you last time about this situation. I met a friend that I hadn't seen for a while, and I asked the question, "How are you doing?" And the answer I got was, it's pretty shitty. I lost my girlfriend, I lost my job, my apartment is, I'm losing my apartment, and things are pretty bad. And then he kind of looked at me and laughed and said, "Well, you asked, right?" So I had to think about, listen in and seeing how I could support him. And luckily enough, because he was honest to me and told me about the situation, I was able to support him with a project job that just came as by chance from another friend. So, and I hooked him up, and he got involved in the job project. So things were pretty good after that. So what I'm saying is just to allowing that curiosity to root and to create space for listening, what's really going on, and then actively thinking about how can I support this person. I think it's also one thing that I think is really important that is related to empathy is about both being forgiving, be able to forgive yourself. Because we will all be caught in situations where we're not. So not to judge ourselves, I'm such a bad person. For instance, I had a thing with my daughter yesterday, and I realized, I didn't do this really good. I didn't manage the situation in a very good situation. But then, the only thing I can do is to go there and apologize. I did something that was. I could have handled that a lot better. I love you. I'm sorry. And of course, she's young, so she forgave me very, very quickly, which is nice. But then also for me to forgive myself. I realized that I could have handled the thing better. Showing that self-empathy, I think I learned something by it. Next time I'm going to be a bit more patient and deal with it. So that forgiving part towards others, and that also builds empathy in relation to ask for forgiveness. I'm sorry, or Brown talks about vulnerability to show that maybe I made a mistake, or raise your hand. I was wrong about this, and being transparent in that case, because that enables people to have empathy for you as well. And I think it then becomes reciprocal. That that it really goes both ways.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think another person who really talks about that in a very constructive way is Patrick Lencioni and his 5 dysfunctions of the team. But that fundamental layer of trust, and if you're going to gain trust, you do need to make yourself vulnerable, and it's a kind of vulnerability that's I don't really understand what's going on or what you're saying, or just admitting that you don't understand, or admitting that you've made a mistake and saying, look, I screwed up here. But it's funny that you relate that story, because actually last week I had a situation, and for whatever reason, we're all struggling with isolation and COVID and so on. So whatever effects that has on our psychology, it certainly does. And I think I underestimate what it does to me, because look, I've been doing personal development for over 20 years, and I coach people, and and then I had this situation last week where I had and it was an issue where I hadn't properly communicated something, and the person that I was dealing with was upset, and then I let myself get totally drawn into it, and I got upset, and then anyway, so I was telling the whole situation to someone, and they really were very supportive. They were very empathetic, and they were like, hey, listen, this is we've all been in situations. Nobody's perfect. We get in we have these moments where we're just not our best selves, but that's not a reflection of who we are as a person in general. And they portrayed a great deal of empathy in it, and I felt a lot better. And then it really just affirmed to me how important that empathy is to me when I experience it from someone else, and it reminds me to be that way with other people. So these are the stories that it's funny. No matter nobody's perfect, and I think the learning journey will continue hopefully throughout our lives. It does, I believe, and so just remembering that there are moments where you're just not going to be the best version of yourself, but you can as long as you're reflective and you learn from those moments, you'll be fine. And I just your question before about what can we do? I just remembered as you were telling that story about I think Stephen Covey. We often go back to him. He has a really good principle in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but it's seek first to understand and then to be understood. I think that's a foundational piece of advice for communication, but also to encourage empathy, right? When you first try to understand what someone else is going through or where they're coming from before you're trying to explain your position, that makes them feel like you're being empathetic to their needs, and it's just going to open up the room for a discussion in a way that's not confrontational, right?
Yeah, and that really goes into being empathetic with your stakeholders as well. One of the favorite exercises that I want to do, both for my own business, but also that I support other businesses to do, is to have these really proactive and deep stakeholder interviews, to really understand what are the needs that, how can I support you on a long-term basis? How are we going to know if we're being successful in supporting you, etc. So really try to understand what their needs are, and then see how you can support. And often it's the other way around. We just try to sell things off. I buy this, do this, but do you need it, right? So it really taps into sales and to what you as an organization or as a team or as in your business. What can you offer to the other person or to the stakeholders, and I think now I'm getting maybe it's a bit big, but the market, we need to create more empathy in the market. We can't just look at numbers all the time. It's not sustainable.
Well, yeah, I think that's what purpose-driven organizations are all about, and you find people needing that more and more. And I mean, we talked about that in our first conversation. Purpose is a really important thing, and I agree with you. It has to be about something bigger, and you have to. I think you're right. Empathy will drive sort of not just what can we convince people to buy, but what are their real needs. Being empathetic to people's needs. And I want to go back for a second to when I'm in the role of a coach. I think when you're in the role of a coach, you get a lot of people coming to you. And sorry to take it. That was a really good point. I just found myself all of a sudden going off on another tangent that I didn't want to forget. But when I think about my role as a coach, you get people that will come in and they'll complain, right? They'll complain about situations or about other people, or and so I find a really good exercise to do is. So tell me what did you see, and then ask them, basically get them to explain to you, how do you know what you saw? How do you know, because what they're telling you is their interpretation of what they saw, and how, just asking that question, how can you know this? Can you be sure about this, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes they can be, and sometimes it's just the way they've interpreted things and the assumptions that they've made. So sorry, I just wanted to slide that in there because the point you brought up is important. I think global awareness of empathy and integrating it into our business models and our a way of interacting, whether it's on a personal level, one-to-one, in organizations, on a country level. I think these are all skills we can implement to make the world a better place, and that's why we're both doing this, right?
It's funny how our conversations are taking us, to look within ourselves, to look at how do we save the world, right? Well, it really goes all over the place.
That's the basis of systemic thinking, right? Is looking at the macro as well as the micro, and recognizing the relationships and seeing that it's not just cause and effect. There are just multiple influences on things, the way things are in the world. And when you can start to recognize, it's not just just oversimplifying things and, clearly those people are bad, these are the good guys, and that's all there is to it, and so I'm going to support these guys. That's how we get wars or confrontation or disputes. It's a lack of empathy for being able to see that, there's no clear good or bad guys. There are people who maybe have a distorted view of the world, or have a dogma that they're following, or have had experiences that have affected the way they see the world and affected the way they behave. And it's not that they're intentionally being, for the most part, I think people are genuinely coming from a place where they think they're doing the right thing. And there's been a lot, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, they say. That's not a quote I like to use often, but it is this. There are a lot of people acting from this sense of I'm doing the right thing, and really doing a lot of harm on the way there, because they're lacking that empathy for who they're acting against, or the way they're marginalizing certain people.
Definitely, yeah, I totally agree with that. That a lot of people think they're doing wonderful things that are actually having a really big impact on things. And I mean, maybe I'm one of them. I hope not, but no. Again, we test back into self-awareness, but also that bias part that you talked about. Because we put on our, I don't even know what you call it, right? But we are
blinders. What the horses
blinders,
have.
Exactly. Yeah. To not see what we don't want to see, but also to feed, as we talked about before, to feed that our own intentions, or that our own thoughts are correct, right? And I really like this ladder of inference model that I use a lot too, that shows you how you record certain data and you take certain data is not relevant to you, so you don't even look at it, and then you create your own reality based on that in various steps, right? But so you end up with, or you start with seeing one behavior, and then if you see that once again, maybe you're going to create a story that this is reality. And it might be that someone is an alcoholic because he had 2 beers or whatever, right? But we have this tendency to do this, and it's rationalizing our own thoughts in a not very empathetic way. So that self-awareness about that is super important.
We've talked about that ladder process before. Can you take me through that again? I think maybe people listening might even be interested in that. What's the process there?
I don't remember all the steps, but it's called the ladder of inference, and basically it's that your mind records things that it thinks it's interesting. So it might be a certain behavior or whatever. For example, if someone comes late to a meeting, you notice that something is that this is happening. And then you put meaning into that, right? So, this person is coming late into the meeting because he or she doesn't care that much about the job, right? And then you take that many steps further, and you see that happening again, perhaps, and that reaffirms that your thoughts are correct, etc. And then it becomes a loop that is creating false assumptions, basically. I mean, it's a false sense of reality, because you're taking certain data of what you're seeing and creating a story around that, and then you're neglecting all the other data that might be telling a fuller story. So, and it seems to be that our mind works like that in certain situations.
Yeah, that's the confirmation bias that a lot of people tap into, and that is extreme at the moment with the way the algorithms around social media work, whether it's YouTube or Instagram or whatever people are using.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they just connect you with things that they think you're interested in, so you start to live in this bubble, this echo chamber, and and it's funny because people are aware that these are there, and then they don't even recognize that they're also victim to it. They're really intelligent people that I'll talk to, and they're talking about, those guys, they're all living in this echo chamber. They just watch this certain news program or whatever, and I was like, well, and what news programs do you watch? And those are also within a certain sphere of influence and a certain ideology, right? And so we're accusing people of things that we're doing ourselves, and so bias. There's just so many different forms of bias. And I think that's probably an interesting conversation we can have as well, just around biases. But the confirmation bias is a really strong one.
Yeah. On that note, I just thought about another really good exercise to do that I was reminded of. I did this course on something called U theory, or theory U. It's called the U Lab. And in there's an exercise that you have to do called the empathy walk. So you have to spend an hour or two with someone who has very different views from you, right? Mm-hmm. And spend an hour or two tap into your active listening, but really try to be empathetic with this person and really try to understand what his or her thoughts are around the world or certain views. I actually ended up having this conversation with someone quite close to me. I don't want to say too much about that in this public space. But it's fascinating because it also shows us how much judgment we put on someone else, right? And if you this proactively listening to where the other person is coming from, and it's I think it creates a lot of empathy in both me and this other person, that we both take steps into widening our perspectives of things and being more understanding. So I think that's a really good exercise to do, actually, to develop our empathy. It's if you have a colleague or someone around you that is just very different from you or have very different opinions from you, take a conversations around that. Do you want to have coffee 1 hour and just I'm curious to understand what's how you see things. And in my experience, that was really constructive, good conversation, and it turned out really, really well.
I'll bet. I think actually maybe that's a great place to wrap things up. And what I'd like to do is do a quick recap of just to hit home to people how important that empathy is, right? So, we've talked about a lot of things here. So empathy is critical for good communication. Empathy is really important for relationships. And in a leadership role, having the capacity to be empathetic, but also interacting with someone who's your boss is important, because, as you said, it's so easy to slag your boss and then but not to recognize the amount of pressure that he or she may be under, from the board or from upper management or whatever. I think so. Just a lot of different levels. So for me, those are kind of the main takeaways. Those are the benefits of empathy. Can you think of any others?
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought about one more thing that you mentioned when you were talking about how was it your customer or your stakeholder, I don't know, that showed that empathy to you, what kind of emotions that creates in you, and what it does for engagement, for creativity, for motivation, for loyalty, etc. So I mean, for the organization or for the follower, if you have a very empathetic leader, I mean, there's so many benefits for the organization as well, and create in terms of productivity, creativity, etc. I mean, I look a lot at inclusive leadership, but there's a lot of similarities, and there's a lot of data showing, you know, how what kind of effects affect have on creativity, what inclusiveness have on creativity, on productivity, etc. So there's, I mean, real feasible benefits for the organization as well.
Yeah, I think without empathy, it's hard to have that level of inclusion, right? If you're judging and you're marginalizing or you're separating yourself, I think that it's the opposite of empathy. And so I think if you want to have, especially in diverse workplaces and where you're getting people of different mindsets, different skill sets, it's important to bring those people together. And without that degree of empathy, that's not there. So. And to quickly recap, you know, the things you can do. Obviously, we talked about having first and foremost a good level of self-awareness, recognize what's happening in you, what assumptions you're making, what emotional state you're in, and then, you know, having those conversations without judgment. What other tips would you give someone how to be more empathetic?
Well, yeah, giving the space to be curious, asking questions, of course, and then we're talking about that space for to be able to listen to the respondent and to proactively support them when you can. Yeah. I mean, and just simple stuff when somebody does something to you that you don't like. I mean, just trying to, if you're cut off in traffic or cut in line or whatever, you know, think about, you know, what's going on here, and go for an empathy walk.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Have coffee with someone that you don't you know, really go along with that much.
That's great. So for anyone listening, if there's someone that you are trying to resolve an issue with, or there's a dispute, or there just is this impasse that you guys can't get beyond, take Toby's advice and go on an empathy walk. Great. Look, it's been a great conversation as always, and I would say anyone listening, if you're interested in more of this, we would love your feedback. You can get in touch. My website, peterteuscher.com. Send a message. You can reach out to Toby through LinkedIn. We would love to hear your comments or questions if there's a topic you'd like us to consider. And we encourage you all to be more empathetic. So I really appreciate this conversation we've had, Toby, and I look forward to the next one.
It was really fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So thanks everyone for listening. We hope you'll come back. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can subscribe, like. We appreciate that. And recommending us to other people if you like. The reason Toby and I do this is really all about helping people with their mental health, with their leadership skills, and creating better organizations. And really, me as a coach, helping people be the best version of themselves. So with that, wish everyone a great day, and Toby, you as well. Look forward to talking to you soon. And that's it for now.
Cheers.
Cheers.